All righty, let's take our Bibles. If you would, please turn to Matthew chapter number 5. Let's take a look at Matthew chapter number 6. And we'll start here, verse number 5. This entire section here, chapter 5 and 6, getting into a lot of teaching. The Lord is trying to correct a lot of misinformation that His people and His followers have. And one topic that we're going to touch upon tonight that He is trying to help us with is the matter of prayer. Matthew chapter number 6, beginning at verse number 5, the Lord there says, "And when thou prayest, thou shalt not be as the hypocrites are, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and in the corners of the streets, that they may be seen of men. Verily, I say unto you, they have their reward. But thou, when thou prayest, enter into thy closet, and when thou hast shut thy door, pray to thy Father which is in secret, and thy Father which seeth in secret shall reward thee openly. But when ye pray, use not vain repetitions as the heathen do, for they think that they shall be heard for their much speaking. Be not ye therefore like unto them, for your Father knoweth what things ye have need of before ye ask Him." We're going to take that same direction that the Lord is using in this passage that we read. And I want to bring a message tonight on the subject of how to fix a broken prayer. I mention it all the time, and I honestly believe it. There's no such thing as a bad prayer, but please understand this, there are better prayers. And so, if you happen to be one of these individuals that you're getting all of your prayers answered, you can go ahead and close your Bible tonight. I don't have anything to teach you. But for the rest of us, there are some things tonight I believe that God can help us with how to fix a broken prayer. In the late 1800s, Dr. John Kellogg was running a health sanitarium with his brother up in Michigan. And this sanitarium had become very, very famous for its ability to improve clients' health. His clientele were the rich and famous. People like President Warren G. Harding would go to this sanitarium to help himself physically. Johnny Weissmuller, who was, I think, the original Tarzan, he would go there often, as did Henry Ford, Amelia Earhart, and even Mary Todd Lincoln. So what was it that made this one sanitarium stand out over and above all of the others in the country? Why was it so famous and why so successful? It was primarily the food that they served. Kellogg was a vegetarian who was into the health food way before there were health food stores. And his patients got a steady diet of very bland food, which meant no spices whatsoever. In order to create an even healthier diet for their patients, Kellogg began experimenting with his own concoctions. One day he and his brother had been cooking some wheat, and they were supposed to take this, put it through a roller, and come out with this long stretch of dough, and then they were going to bake it and that sort of thing. But they got called away from it. They got busy doing other things, and by the time that they finally got back to the kitchen, they found that this concoction that they had was already stale, it was unusable, but he was cheap. Instead of throwing it out, he went ahead and ran it through the machine anyway. Instead of it coming out a long stretch of dough that they could be baking, it came out in bits and pieces. And he thought to himself, that's different. Tasted it, tasted okay, but it was just in a bunch of broken up fragments, and so he kind of experimented with different grains and came up with what he called cornflakes. The patients loved it. And not only was it halfway decent tasting, especially compared to what they were probably eating the other time, it was inexpensive, it was healthy. All they did was they made one little change to what they were doing, and it's like they found a gold mine. Same ingredients, but a little bit different in the preparation, and they have an amazingly better product. The same thing could be said about prayer. We already know how valuable it is, and yet few people realize that if they would be willing to make some changes, they just might discover a transformation in the prayer closet, something that could be a very, very powerful change as to what they're doing. When I was a teenager, I used to drive an old Volkswagen Bug to school, and I really loved that car. Man, that was my first car. I loved that thing. It was so much fun to drive, but boy, it was slow. It was real slow. I used to sit around and I would go page by page through the J.C. Whitney catalog. And I would read about all of these wonderful things that were in this catalog that would boost the horsepower of any car. And I saw pills that you could put into the gas tank and get 15 horsepower more. And I saw these wonderful electronic gadgets, and if you would just plug them in, man, you'd get another 30 horsepower. And if I just had the money to buy these products, I could have had a Volkswagen that had, 700 horsepower maybe. Yeah. And so, over a period of time, I discovered that many, if not most, of those gadgets just don't work. Tonight I'm going to show you some prayer gadgets that are guaranteed to boost your prayer horsepower by a huge amount. I'm going to give you, I don't recall how many, somewhere between 5 and 50. I've lost track. But I'm going to give some gadgets to you tonight, guaranteed to work, but you don't have to have all of them. Just one just might make a huge improvement in your prayer closet. If you would, turn to Genesis chapter 18. First thing tonight that will improve your prayer life tremendously, number one is this: a prayer can be made better by character. In Genesis 18, we have a conversation that's taken place between Abraham and the Lord. And the topic of the discussion has to do with the coming destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Lot happens to live there. Abraham is wanting to spare this place, not because he's in love with Sodom and Gomorrah. He doesn't want Lot to get hurt. And therefore, when he's informed by the Lord that God is considering wiping Sodom and Gomorrah off the face of the map, he starts to protest. He's engaged in a conversation. He's trying to change the Lord's mind. Genesis 18, verse 23 in the Bible here says, "And Abraham drew near and said, Wilt thou also destroy the righteous with the wicked? Peradventure there be 50 righteous within the city. Wilt thou also destroy and not spare the place for the 50 righteous that are therein? That be far from thee to do after this manner, to slay the righteous with the wicked, and that the righteous should be as the wicked. That be far from thee. Shall not the judge of all the earth do right? And the Lord said, If I find in Sodom 50 righteous within the city, then I will spare all the place for their sakes." In this conversation, we find the Lord accepting Abraham's plea on behalf of Sodom if a certain number of people, saved people, are found living there. And if you were to read the entire passage, you'd find that the Lord was willing to go down all the way from 50 righteous down to 10. But why did God allow himself to be moved by Abraham's prayer? I mean, what was it about Abraham that he got his prayer answered? Because whatever worked for him, it just might work for you and I as well. So what was the secret? Look at verse 17. And the Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham that thing which I do, seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him? For I know him, that he will command his children and his household after him. Now we know that Abraham was a man of great faith who was able to talk with God on a regular basis. He knew how to get his prayers answered. But how did he do that? What did God see in his prayers that caused him to want to say yes? What God saw was not in his prayers. It was in his life. That's why he said, I know him. I've seen him. I've watched him. It's not necessarily his prayers that I'm impressed with. I'm impressed with his life. I'm impressed with his character. Now, we all know that God is not a respecter of people per se, but what we too often forget is the fact that God is a respecter of character. After Cain killed his brother, he complained that the Lord's judgment was too severe for him. Somebody's going to kill me because of what I did. And so while Cain is whining and complaining to God, and by the way, that too is what prayer is, God listened to his words, listened to his complaint, listened to his whining, and God put a mark on Cain that would protect him and serve as a warning to anybody who considered about killing him. Now, if God chose to answer the prayer of a man like Cain, just think of how many more prayers we could get answered if we had some character like Abraham. Character is not the same as personality. Our personality is formed and shaped by our childhood experiences. We get our personality from our parents, from our friends, and from the Lord. But our character is something that is formed and shaped by our decisions. You see, if we choose to be an outgoing, decisive person who takes charge when we're really a quiet, reclusive introvert, we can fake it for a while, but after a period of time, we're going to go back to who we really are. That's our personality. But our character is something that can be altered and changed at will. Our character is something that can become a permanent change by making the right decisions in life. When God mentioned the fact that he knew Abraham, he was referring to the fact that he knew Abraham was a man of character, and it was that character that caused God to be willing to respond to Abraham and to alter his decision to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah if there were 10 righteous who were found. Turn to Exodus chapter 32, verse 31. Some are thinking, boy, I don't know if I can do that one. Character, I got to have more character to get my prayers answered? Preacher, what's number 2? A prayer can be made better by a broken heart. Exodus chapter 32, verse 31. And Moses returned unto the Lord and said, Oh, this people have sinned a great sin and have made them gods of gold. Yet now, if thou wilt forgive their sin, and if not, blot me, I pray thee, out of thy book, which thou hast written. This chapter details one of the darkest days in Israel's history, the day when God's people decided to worship the golden calf, or at least some of the people did. Moses was gone. He was on top of Mount Sinai receiving from God the 10 Commandments. Aaron was left in charge, and he was responsible for giving the people what they wanted, and that was a God that was unlike Jehovah God. They knew God only well enough to know, I don't know that I enjoy his decisions. I don't know that I agree with his direction. He seems too harsh, too unloving, too uncaring. Sure would be nice if we had a different God. Well, they got what they wanted in the golden calf. And as soon as they had that golden calf in their midst, they broke out the wrong kind of music. Then they began worshiping the wrong kind of God. Then they took off their clothes and began dancing in a wrong kind of worship. When Moses heard the sound of a party going on, he came down into the camp. He dealt with the golden calf and the people, and then immediately he returned back into the Lord's presence, and he then began pouring out his heart to the Lord. And in your Bible, if you look again at verse 32, it mentions, "Yet now, if thou wilt forgive their sin," and in my Bible, probably yours as well, is a hyphen. That hyphen represents a pause that was inserted by the King James translators to reveal the fact that as Moses was praying this prayer, he broke down and wept, barely able to finish this prayer. That hyphen represents a broken heart. While the Lord did not give the people a pass, he did in fact extend to them his mercy, and he didn't kill all of them which deserved to be eliminated. God has spent a total of 80 days with Moses on top of Mount Sinai. And as he considered Moses, he described him as his servant. He also mentioned the fact that Moses was on such an intimate basis with him that he spoke to Moses face to face as with no other man. But what was it about Moses that caused God to be so receptive to his prayers? It was that little hyphen. It was his broken heart. And Moses had allowed his heart to be broken because he had a heart for these people. He also had a heart for God. And to his credit, he allowed his heart to be broken time and time again. You say, "Preacher, I really struggle with some things in my life. I just don't know if I have the character at that level to get my prayers answered." If you don't, or if you can't, there is something else that is almost magical, guaranteed to capture God's attention, and that is to pray with a tear. There is something that grabs hold of the heart of God when he sees one of his people that has been run over and trampled by circumstances. They don't know where else to turn. As tears are streaming down that person's face, they might not even be able to speak, for they're weeping so much. God is not listening to the words as much as he's looking at the heart. And when the heart is broken, God has his ear cocked and he is listening very intently. Turn, if you would, to Job chapter 1 and verse number 6. A third thing mentioned in the Bible that can so transform a person's prayer life, and that is, a prayer can be made better by our walk with God. Job chapter 1 and verse 6, "Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them. And the Lord said unto Satan, Whence comest thou? Then Satan answered the Lord and said, From going to and fro in the earth, and from walking up and down in it. And the Lord said unto Satan, Hast thou considered my servant Job, that there is none like him in the earth, a perfect and an upright man, one that feareth God and escheweth evil? What kind of a man was Job? An entire book was written about this individual, and listening to God bragging on him, it was obvious that he was one of a kind. God identifies him as a servant, calls him such. Job was described as being unlike anybody else in the entire world. God mentions the fact that he was perfect, meaning that he was full grown, he was mature, there was no spiritual immaturity in him at all. He was an upright man, meaning that God looked upon him and saw that Job was as straight as an arrow in relation to his integrity and honesty. He was fearful of God and refused to do anything that might disappoint the Lord. And he not only refused to do evil, but the word escheweth means that he was on the warpath against evil in every form. He went looking for it to make sure that it did not hurt anybody, and then he did everything he could to destroy it. So what does all of that add up to? Listen to this verse in Amos chapter 3, verse 3. There's a question. Can two walk together except they be agreed? As I read this description of Job, it's almost as if I'm reading a description of my Lord. An upright man, one that hates and despises that which is evil, perfect in every way. And as we listen to this description about Job, it's so reminiscent about Jesus Christ. It's not hard to imagine at all these two walking together, for they were so much alike. So how did Job do in his prayer life? Well, after having been stripped of everything of value in his life, Job is then brought to the end of himself. In Job chapter 4 and verse 6, it says, Wherefore I abhor myself and repent in dust and ashes. And verse 10 says, And the Lord turned the captivity of Job when he prayed for his friends. Also the Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before. He was the godliest man in the world before his trials even started. And through it all, he was then made even better. And when he was willing to pray for those who had hurt him the most, God then gave to Job twice what he had lost. So how do you have a walk with God? Before you leave the house in the morning, or whenever it is that you leave, you got to decide to spend time with him. I think as well as anybody else here, that's not an easy thing. Some of us have so many things crying for attention. It is difficult to find the right amount of time for all of the right things that need to be done and accomplished. And too many times, we end up cheating God out of the time that He deserves. And therefore, in order to have a walk with God, it's going to require a commitment of time on our part. And before we ever leave the house to begin a day, we've got to establish that walk with God. You don't have to be able to walk on water, but He's very passionate about His book, and you're not going to have a walk with God without getting into this Bible. Nobody says how many chapters you have to read. 10 is not a magic number, neither is 3. But you've got to be willing to get into the book. And you've got to be willing to get things right with the Lord in the prayer closet. And I'll tell you what, the hardest thing about prayer is not making it happen. The hardest thing about prayer is confessing our sins. The confession is so difficult getting things right with God is so hard, that is what destroys the prayer closet more than anything else. We must be willing to make things right. Turn to Mark chapter 12, verse 38, if you would. Something else about prayer that I think it is so simple and yet so helpful, and that is a prayer can be made better by its brevity, by keeping it short. Mark chapter 12 and verse 38, and he said unto them in his doctrine, beware of the scribes which love to go in long clothing and love salutations in the marketplaces and the chief seats in the synagogues and the uppermost rooms at feasts, which devour widows' houses, and for a pretense make long prayers. These shall receive greater damnation. There is something about praying that causes most people to think that longer is better. The misconception is the longer that a person prays, the more spiritual that person must be. And by using the length of a person's prayer as a yardstick, people will also come to the wrong conclusion that short prayers must belong only with those that are not so spiritual. Do you recall Peter's prayer when he stepped out of the boat, challenged by the Lord to come to him, and he ended up walking on the water until he got distracted by the waves and the wind, and all of a sudden he decides to pray to the Lord. And in Matthew chapter 14, verse 30, only part of that verse is found containing all of his prayer, and all of his prayer consisted of 3 words: Lord, save me. On the other end of that spectrum, and by the way, the Lord answered that prayer, as short as it was, and yet on the other end of that spectrum were the Pharisees. And the Lord called them out and revealed to those who were listening that the Pharisees deliberately prayed long, flowery prayers with the intent of giving the impression that they were very, very spiritual. It was, in the words of the Lord, for a pretense. They were hiding their ungodliness by wrapping themselves in long prayers, which was offensive to the Lord. So will short prayers really be heard better than long prayers? The issue is not really the length of a prayer as much as its sincerity. But it just seems, I don't know, maybe it's just me, but it just seems that when a person is speaking from the heart, their words are usually shorter and simpler. Their sentences are shorter, and their wording is more conversational. When I first got saved and into a Baptist church, I started to learn who the different famous preachers were. As I started going to Bible conferences, and when another church had some guest speaker in, I'd go over to that church to listen to a famous preacher. It was during that time that I came upon a really big name preacher who was known for being very articulate in his preaching, and he was very long-winded in his praying. The reason that his grammar was so precise was because before he was ever called to preach, he was a teacher. He corrected the grammar of students. And so he always was very precise in his choice of words. And the reason that he prayed so long, and I'm telling you, I have never heard of any preacher who prayed as long as this man. And I assumed it was because, wow, he must really be spiritual. It was only years later that I learned that while he was traveling the country preaching in all of these major Bible conferences, and while he was pastoring a church that averaged 3,500 every Sunday, he was also molesting the little girls in his church. But boy, could he pray long. Long prayers have not impressed me from that time to this. You want to make an impression with God? Don't try to impress. Let me throw out a pet peeve. You're going to go visit some churches and you're going to see things there that you don't see things here. Let me throw out one thing that you don't see here very often at all. And I see it all the time when I'm visiting in churches. I see this all the time. And that is, the pastor will ask one of the men to pray. I don't do that. You know why? I don't even like to pray in public. And the reason is there is a huge temptation to pray for your approval instead of his approval. If I wrestle with that, why in the world do I want to put that on somebody else and put them in a position where they're going to be in trouble with God because they were praying as the hypocrites pray, trying to impress people instead of talking to the Lord? I see it all the time. It bothers me. I don't like it. Public prayer, it can be a wonderful tool to kind of help us all get into the same spiritual groove, but boy, it can become a trap. So readily, so easily. Something else that'll make our prayers better, turn to 1 Kings chapter 3 if you would. A prayer is made better by humility. Following the death of King David, Solomon was thrust into the position as Israel's new king, and the first thing that he did was to pray. Listen to this prayer, 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 7. And now, O Lord my God, thou hast made thy servant king instead of David my father, and I am but a little child. I know not how to go out or come in. And thy servant is in the midst of thy people, which thou hast chosen, a great people that cannot be numbered nor counted for multitude. Give therefore thy servant an understanding heart to judge thy people, that I may discern between good and bad, for who is able to judge this thy so great a people? And the speech pleased the Lord that Solomon had asked this thing. And God said unto him, because thou hast asked this thing, and hast not asked for thyself long life, neither hast thou asked riches for thyself, nor hast asked the life of thine enemies, but hast asked for thyself understanding to discern judgment. Behold, I have done according to thy words. Lo, I have given thee a wise and an understanding heart, so that there was none like thee before thee, neither after thee shall any arise like unto thee. And I have also given thee that which thou hast not asked, both riches and honor, so that there shall not be any among the kings like unto thee all thy days. There are three things in Solomon's prayer that impressed the Lord tremendously. And the first thing was what he asked for. He did not have a long laundry list like I have. He didn't have this long list of things that you have. He only asked for one thing. And that was, he wanted discernment. I don't know exactly what he was looking at, exactly what he was facing. It may be that he knew that there were some people that were trying to steal the throne. There were politicians in the palace. And for a brand new king, it would be mighty tough to know who's wearing the white hats and who's wearing the black hats. How could he tell who the good guys were and who the bad guys were? How could he know what laws to pass, what recommendations to strike down? How could he possibly know these things? So he asked for discernment. The second thing that impressed the Lord about this prayer was what he did not ask for. And God mentions this. God is telling Solomon, I want to tell you why I'm about to bless you beyond your imagination. I'm thrilled to hear you just asking for one thing. Discernment. The ability to see things from God's vantage point. And something else, Solomon, that is so impressive to me is what you did not ask for. You did not ask for a long life. You did not ask for a lot of money. You did not ask for victories over your enemies. Now, those things that he didn't ask for are not wrong things. If you have those, some of them or all of them on your prayer list, there's nothing wrong with asking for those things. But the point that God is trying to make is, I hear those requests all the time. I'm always getting asked for more money. Who doesn't want to live longer? Who doesn't want to enjoy success? But God hears those things all the time. What catches his attention is when somebody doesn't ask for them. Not that they were wrong to ask for, but it's so rare when somebody is willing to ask for something that they view as being even more important than those things. And the number one thing that Solomon wanted, money, he's already living in a nice house. Success, if he applies himself, if he does right, success will come when God wants it to. The question is, how can I please God with the many decisions that I have to make? Discernment was at the top of his one-item list. It was also at the bottom of his list. It was the only thing on the list. The third thing about Solomon's prayer that especially endeared him to the Lord was how he prayed. Because he didn't demand anything. In fact, the most striking thing about his prayer was his humility. Solomon was a young man, probably around the age of 20. He did not have any experience as a ruler, as a soldier, or as a politician. He had lived somewhat of a sheltered life, as his father, King David, would have done anything and everything to protect him, as did his mother. And therefore, he was a complete novice. And when it came to running the nation, the important thing that he knew was he didn't know what he was doing. He knew he was ignorant. It was his lack of experience as well as his humility that pleased God so much so that God chose not only to answer his prayer, but God chose to give him more than what he asked. And God chose to give to him both riches and honor. Solomon became one of the wealthiest men in the world, if not the wealthiest. He was also known as the wisest man alive, which caused leaders and royalty to travel from their nation to Jerusalem just to be able to witness and to hear his wisdom. So how can we learn how to impress the Lord the same way that Solomon did? Number one, we need to pray for God to give you what is needed to do His will. He is very passionate about His will. If you want to impress the Lord, pray for God to give to you what you need to do His will. For example, is it wrong for a person to pray for a nice car? It is God's will for you to be in church. And so if you need a more reliable car so that you can be in church, pray for it. If a better car is going to help you to become a better Christian, more faithful, what's wrong with that? That's not praying selfishly. It's praying in such a fashion that God would like to help you to be more faithful to church. It is also God's will for you to be generous. So pray that He will prosper you financially so that you can give more to the church and so that you can help more people. The problem is not praying for God to bless you financially so that you can give more to God's work. The problem is to pray for more money and then you keep it all to yourself. Praying for the same thing, for more money. But there is such a difference between praying that you could be a bigger giver than for praying that you could have more money to spend on yourself. The idea is that you need to avoid the typical prayer that is all about me. James chapter 4, verse 3, ye ask and receive not. Well, how come? Because ye ask amiss, that ye may consume it upon your lusts. Most prayers are not answered simply because they're selfish. Solomon got his answered because he was praying for something that would help him to better please the Lord. Number one, pray for God to give to you what is needed to do His will. Number two, don't tell God how to do it. We usually like to solve our problem, and then we take our solution into the prayer closet and see if God will put His stamp of approval on it. When we do that, what we're saying is, God, I'm smarter than you are. I found a great solution, and I hope that I can talk you into it. Get you to agree to what I want to take place. Solomon did not ask for the results that he wanted. He asked for discernment to understand what needed to be done. In other words, instead of praying for God to do it all, he prayed that he could have the understanding so that he could do it. And number three, you need to pray as a child speaking to your Father. Do you know what one of the sweetest things is about a child? They are so eager to learn. Boy, they're good at asking questions. In fact, they probably will ask more questions than you will want to answer. In fact, they will develop one short question that'll cause you to become hoarse every time you hear it, and that is, why? 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 They're like a sponge soaking up water, and they are naturally receptive to new truth. Solomon didn't have a problem with pride because he knew that he was ignorant in a lot of different areas, but he was willing to learn. That's why he didn't ask for things. Instead, he asked for knowledge and understanding. And what is one of the most important things that God the Father would have us to know? They used to have a TV program called Father Knows Best. And that pretty well sums up what God would have us to know and have us to learn. That Father always knows best. He knows what we need. He knows when we need it, and He knows how long we're going to need it. And the prayer that He will love to hear more than anything is the prayer of a child who is trusting Daddy because Daddy has never let me down yet. Let's bow for prayer.